This is one of those moments when I'm reminded that women's history should be studied by everyone, because the system of separate spheres is not just about controlling the lives of women, but in fact about structuring families, structuring society, structuring masculinity as well. And so I wondered if I could ask you to say a little bit more about how this system underlay sort of the social functions of the family and of individuals in this early 19th century moment.
I'm not sure that I would call it a system of separate spheres. I think I'd call it an ideology of separate spheres. That is a set of ideas that moves people to act in certain kinds of ways. But you're quite right that this ideology of separate spheres becomes, for a while, relatively speaking, if not controlling, very influential in determining how people think about how they should behave. And I mean, look at masculinity, for example, because that's always something that people neglect to look at. When they think about separate spheres, they think about women functioning within the household as a separate sphere. But in fact, the notion that women could and should function within the space of their households is limited. It's limited both by class, but also by the way in which gender operates within class perspectives. So men, for example, you know, we're in the early 1800s in a place where men are beginning to move out into the world, into factory jobs, into workshops as artisans and so on. And as they do so, they are walking away from their in-home roles. So whereas before they used to be able to do their work inside the household, now men are increasingly working outside the household, which means that the shape of the household has taken a different form in their minds. If they're going to be able to work outside the household, then somebody has to keep a household going, if there is to be a household at all. So while on the one hand, women are, if you like, increasingly, ideologically at least, confined to the household, men are encouraged to do more and more and more to make that household possible and prosperous and comfortable. And that means that they're driven to, we would now call it success, the success ethic. They're driven to not just make a living, but make a good living. Now, what does that do to the notion of work? Whereas work in the 18th century, even for an artisan, was a craft often done to his own satisfaction, and if sold, then sold as a complete product. Now the work done by a man was done for instrumental reasons. And of course that process takes a long period of time. But the very notion of masculinity, that is the capacity to do a good job at one's craft, changes to the capacity to sustain and support a household at a certain level of income. Now that's a very different view of who a man is and how a man thinks about himself. And now think about how that breaks down in class terms, and you get some idea of how complicated it is. The more affluent, if you like, the more upper middling class a family thinks of itself, the less a woman works outside the home or engages in producing income of any kind. And the harder a man has to work to produce and maintain a lifestyle that the family is accustomed to, a lifestyle which often utilizes servants. On the other hand, poor men or many immigrant men, many free African Americans and so on, still have the benefit of a wife's labor or a daughter's labor. And so for them, being a man still means something quite different from being what you might now call a gentleman in the early part of the in the early part of the 19th century. So you're quite right. This notion of separate spheres, it's an ideology that it just changes the way that people think about where they should be in relationship to each other, but also in relationship to class, and we'll discover pretty soon in relationship to race.
And we saw a little of this at the Merchant's House Museum, that there's an ideology perhaps of separate spheres, of women working only in the home or in fact not working, and yet we see in the Merchant House many women of many different classes all working.
Yes, and that of course is one of the big lessons of a place like the Merchant House, is that we learn that what we are beginning to call work, which is working for an income, is not the only kind of work there is, and that all the women in that household were working in one way or another. The definition of what's public and what isn't is an issue here. If women are confined to the home or meant to operate within a separate sphere, then at some level they are not meant to be seen in public, to write for the public, to speak in public, to protest in public. So all of those things are, by some people and in some measure, written out of women's separate sphere. But that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we know that women do write in public and do speak in public. And so we have to begin to ask the question of whether separate sphere is an ideology that we as historians impose on the past in order to make sense of it and to make sense of what women are doing, or an ideology that's interpreted in different ways by women who are actually living the situation.
Well, and this raises a lot of questions for historians. You mentioned earlier that Gotti's Lady Book, one of the major publications of the era, was for a time considered the authoritative source on how women actually lived. But historians began, and I believe began during another era of women's activism, to uncover different artifacts, different documents that challenged that interpretation of the past and perhaps challenged the idea that separate spheres was as total an ideology as we might have thought.
Yes, here's one of the ways that the current movement that we call women's history has illuminated what really happens in the past. So while Godey's Ladies Book, for example, it's a great example of the kind of magazine. It's a regularly issued magazine read by many women, including fictional stories as well as tales that are perhaps non-fictional, or we don't really know what they are. But all those tales are meant to provide women with instruction, let me put it that way, as to how they should behave. So stories about young women who marry and don't know how to supervise a servant. So now we have a tale of an unhappy husband who finally teaches his wife how to do that kind of supervision. Or a young woman who doesn't know how to spend money appropriately, and so on. And there are dozens, literally dozens and maybe hundreds of such stories. So as we read Godey's Ladies Book, we also read it as a portrait of how women, what they should look like, how they should behave, what they might feed their children, what their duty is as mothers, and so on. Now then, we take a look at what women themselves have written, and the middling sort of women in the 19th century are great diary keepers. They write letters to each other because it's the only way to communicate with their sisters and their friends from childhood. And in those letters and diaries, we begin to discover what women actually think and how they actually spend their days. So from those diaries, we heard one, a little tiny bit of one in the first part of today's discussion, in which Martha Coffin talked about how much she hated what she was doing in the housework. We learn those from the letters. We learn them even more from the diaries that women kept. But at the same time, we also learn that this notion of separate spheres was not nearly as confining as it is in the ideology, because women imagined that their homes existed not in isolation, but within communities. And because they existed within communities, they were free to go into those communities in order, as they would tell themselves, to protect their own homes. So they became active in churches, for example, because part of their job was the moral, spiritual morality of their own homes. So out into the church they had to go, and they needed to be able to speak in some ways, so they joined women's church associations in order to do that. They go out into the workforce, and it's interesting that early wage work for women is often called public work as opposed to private work. But they go out into the wage labor force not in order to enrich themselves or in order to become themselves socially mobile, as their husbands or brothers might have done, but in order to help support families and family life. And that's a notion which gives you a kind of different idea of what's a separate sphere anyway, becomes the question.
Well, and this speaks, I think, to why history is so important for uncovering these kinds of developments, because as you read in one of the earlier lectures, the idea of separate spheres was treated as natural, conforming to the dictates of nature, the dictates of scripture. But in fact, we see here that it evolves, and that the 18th century household is quite a different place than the early 19th century household in some ways, and allows us to historicize a little bit that seeming natural division of men and women.